In this video, I'm going to show you how to do the Hong Kong finish. We'll be using it on the inside of a garment as a clean finish on the seam allowance. That way we can get rid of this raw edge of the seam allowance. And you'll need 2 strips of bias. These are 2-inch wide bias strips I have here. And if you need to know how to find bias, true bias, and to cut 2-inch wide or cut bias strips in general, I've posted a link in the description below that you can click on, and that will take you to a video that shows you how to do that. Alright, so let's go ahead to the sewing machine and start doing this Hong Kong finish. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is isolate my seam allowance, one of my seam allowances. So I'm going to pull that over like so, and everything else has been moved to the opposite side of the seam allowance I'm going to sew on. And then I'm going to take one of my bias strips that I've cut, and I'm going to put the right side of the bias strip against the right side of the seam allowance. Just real quick, seam allowance has a right and wrong side. The side of the seam allowance that touches the body is the right side. You can see it has the markings on it. And then the other side that's touching the wrong side of the fashion fabric, okay, this inside edge here, that's the wrong side of your seam allowance. So I'm going to put the right side of my bias against the right side of my seam allowance. And I'm going to line up the cut edge of my bias with the cut edge of my seam allowance. So just like so. I always like to have longer bias strips than I need. Makes it a little, just in case I need a little extra or something. It gives me a little bit of play. And now I'm going to sew this bias strip onto the seam allowance at 1/4 inch. Alright. Be careful when sewing your bias on not to stretch it. It can stretch very easily. You want to stretch it out. And it can also act a little bit like an elastic. If you stretch it too much, it'll kind of pull itself in when you're done sewing it and kind of create gathers, which you do not want on your seam allowance. There we go. Alright. So now we need to go to the iron, and we need to press this bias strip over and then under. Okay, so let's go to the ironing board and do that. Alright, here we are at the ironing board. So again, first thing I need to do is press this the bias strip away from my seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do that. When I do that, I want all the seam allowance, so that 1/4 inch seam allowance I have now of the bias strip and the seam allowance, pressed away from the seam allowance, which it's already doing. Let's give that a good press. So, now I'm going to flip this to the wrong side, like so. And there we can see underneath my seam allowance. Now I want to press this bias strip over to the back side of the seam allowance. Okay. When I do that, I don't want to press it over and make it too tight so it kind of crumples up or smushes that 1/4 inch seam allowance. I want the crease I'm going to make to rest right against the cut edge of that seam allowance. Okay. And I don't want to make it too big. I don't want this kind of big bubble. I want the crease, when I fold this over, to just be touching that cut edge. Okay. So let's go ahead and do that now. There we go. So I can fold this over to the right side. Whoops. Okay. And you can see what that looks like. Just pressed over and then under. So now we're going to go back to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch right in the ditch. Okay. That's that seam we just made. When we say stitch in the ditch, we're going to sew right in the seam that we just made by sewing the bias onto that seam allowance. When I do that, that will catch this back end that's not sewn down yet. Alright, so let's go to the machine and do that. Alright, we're back here at the machine. Again, I still have that one seam allowance I sewed the bias strip to, isolated, so everything else is folded to the other side. And I'm going to go ahead and stitch right in that seam. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Stitch in the ditch. Then we're going to back tack beginning and end here. Now when you're doing this, you want to kind of pull that bias strip and the seam allowance in two opposite directions to kind of open up that seam so you can kind of get right in there. And again, when your thread matches the fabric you're sewing on, it kind of hides those stitches a lot better. Go. I can cut off this extra bias on the edges. And now I can flip this around. Okay, or look at it. So I've stitched right in that ditch there, kind of right in between the bias and the seam allowance. I'm going to flip this around. I have all this extra bias that I don't need. I'm going to trim that back to 1/8 of an inch. Okay, there it is. It's the right side, and there's the wrong side. You have a raw edge here, but that's on bias, so it won't fray, and it's in between the back of your seam allowance and your garment, so no one will ever see it. And that's the Hong Kong finish. So let's go ahead and do this other side really quickly, so you can see it again. All right, so I'm isolating my seam allowance. I'm going to take my bias strip, and I'm going to put the right side of my bias strip against the right side of my seam allowance, lining up the cut edge of my bias strip and seam allowance, and I'm going to go ahead and sew that on at 1/4 of an inch. Cut that even for now. Alright, so now I'm going to go to the ironing board, press that over, and then under. Okay, here we are. So let's go ahead and press the bias back over that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we'll flip it to the wrong side. And I'm going to press it around so that the crease I make is just touching that cut edge of the seam allowance, but it's not bunching it up. There we go. And we'll go back and stitch it. And this time, instead of stitching the ditch, you could also, if stitching the ditch is too hard, you can stitch right on the edge of the bias, about 1/16 of an inch away from that seam. And that's what I'll do this time. Either way is fine. There we go. Okay, so now again I have this extra fabric here. I'm going to trim that back to 1/8. Right side, let's give it a quick press. And there you go, Hong Kong finish. All right, good luck everyone.